ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, coming to you from Gadigal Land. This is ABC News Daily. One of the biggest problems we're facing as a nation right now is a lack of housing, which is leading to soaring rents. It's also resulting in a spike in the number of Australians who find themselves homeless. Today, the ABC's social affairs correspondent, Norman Hermont, on how we ended up here and what needs to be done to fix it. Norm, we know that housing is a massive challenge at the moment for so many people in this country, and it's something that you've been covering a lot.
Well, what we've been doing, Sam, is talking to a lot of advocacy groups who deal with people seeking help for homelessness in person. And they all report the same thing across the country, that they have never really seen this much sustained demand for their services. There's a term in the sector called turnaways. It's a term they don't like to mention because a turnaway is someone who comes for emergency assistance, and because of capacity constraints, they're turned away. They don't have any ability to help those people. Now, no frontline service wants to do that, but some of them are having to adopt that strategy because they're simply being overwhelmed by people who are coming in for assistance.
Gosh, yeah, really, really difficult. I think that's something that probably a lot of Australians don't understand is actually happening. It's not, we can't see it, can we?
Well, what people often see is the very, very visible sign of homelessness, which is rough sleeping. So people notice an increase in rough sleeping and they think, oh, there's an increase of homelessness. But rough sleeping is really the very final sign that the system is totally overwhelmed because homelessness, as advocates will tell you, the definition is really as somebody who just does not have a fixed address. So much of homelessness is people who are either living in very crowded circumstances. We all know the term couch surfing. Certainly for young Australians, they'll be familiar with that. And really, as it was explained to me, Sam, is there's this phenomenon called the cascade effect that we're seeing now. And this is when people who were in middle income housing, because of cost of living and rent pressures, they start to look for more and more cheaper properties. And eventually, when you get to the bottom of that pyramid, at the cheapest properties, the people who can only afford the cheapest properties, they're essentially squeezed out.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing now.
Tell me about Abby Manning. That's one of the people that you met.
So Abby Manning, we really focused on her because she's an example of someone who is really, really struggling to adequately provide for herself on Centrelink benefits. So she spent much of 21 and 22 on the youth allowance.
I was starving myself. I was restricting the amount of food I was eating, not because, I wanted to, or because it was literally because I didn't know what was left on the shelf.
The youth allowance, for people that don't know, is currently $250, $260 a week. And during that period, she was trying to go to TAFE to study disability services, and she just found that youth allowance was not enough money for her to continue studying. What she told us was she kept having to borrow money from her friends. She lives in a share house with 6 people. Believe it or not, there's even a 7th person living in a van in the driveway.
Oh my gosh.
And in this share house, she was having to consistently borrow money from her friends to make the rent. She got a job for 5 months working as an organizer for the Greens, actually, leading up to the last election. But then she lost that job. It was only temporary, and she's now unemployed.
It's really difficult, and it makes me feel like the government, is kind of leaving us behind and doesn't care about our struggles.
So she's somebody who's barely hanging on.
Yeah.
But we have spoken to other people who weren't able to do that.
Yeah, right. So Abby's in a really difficult position, but she does, for now at least, have a roof over her head. But then, as you say, there's people who are having to live on the street. So let's look at Rhiannon's case.
I just feel really hopeless
So Rhiannon's a pseudonym. She was someone who was brought to our attention in Brisbane. Now, Brisbane has a very obvious problem that if you speak to people there, it's very easily to see in the city's west end and on the outskirts of the CBD. There are visible signs of homelessness, people starting to sleep in tents. Rhiannon's an interesting example because she has gone through virtually every part of the homelessness journey. So due to a family situation, she left home. She first went to a share house. That didn't work out. She's been in emergency crisis accommodation. Amongst the worst experiences for her was when she wound up having an extended stay in a hostel. And eventually, for several nights, she really had no option but to we call it rough sleeping. I'm not even going to say rough sleeping because she did not go to sleep all night. As in her words, she was terrified. She wound up sitting on a street in the west end of Brisbane for a couple of nights, just waiting for the morning to come.
It's terrifying. The reason why I didn't sleep was because I didn't want to be attacked. I didn't want to be assaulted or anything like that. It's you're very vulnerable. You feel very scared, and
luckily for her, she wound up getting into a share house. She couldn't pay the rent there either, but luckily for her, she has a very kind landlord who is covering her rent for now, but it's a temporary situation and she fears she could be out on the streets soon again.
Gosh, it's just so hard. And she's so young. And as you say, it's not safe for her to stay in some of these places. So let's, Norm, have a look at how many Australians are in a similar position to Rhiannon now. That is, in recent times, they've basically become homeless.
It's a difficult one because I've talked about this anecdotal evidence that we're hearing from homelessness services across the country. Now, last month, the ABS put out some statistics that showed homelessness had increased about 5% since the last census, so from 2016 to 2021. But those statistics were taken on census night in August 2021. So they really almost predate this cost of living and particularly this rental crisis that we're going through. So almost every advocate that you'll speak to will tell you that they think that those numbers are a severe underestimation of how much this problem has increased. So, for example, if you want to picture this again, we were focusing in Brisbane. Brisbane Youth Services, since 2020 to last fiscal year, end of 2022, their urgent services are up 88% over 3 years ago. So they've almost doubled in terms of the people they are seeing coming to them for emergency assistance, either for housing or for emergency financial assistance to try and stay in a place and keep a roof over their heads.
Okay, so we better have a look at how we actually got here. You mentioned before this cascading effect. So the bottom of the rental market, they've been pushed completely out of the rental market into homelessness. How does that work? How does the real estate market flow affect homelessness?
So if you talk to people who know a lot about this, for instance, we spoke to Michael Fotheringham at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. They will tell you that a typical well-functioning rental market usually has a vacancy rate of between 2.5 and 3%.
That represents the churn of properties as people move out, new people move in, new properties come onto the market. So we're well below that rate.
What we have seen over the last more than a year in Australia is a record low vacancy rate in terms of how long it's been low. It's been around 1%, sometimes dipping below 1% for more than a year now.
What we're seeing is both very low vacancy rates and consistently low vacancy rates in a way we've not seen in the last 20, 25 years, but also, sharply increasing prices. So the last couple of years we saw 15% and 10% increases. We're going to see even more this year.
And that just means that there just isn't enough rental stock available, which of course sends the price of rents up, which only exacerbates this effect we're talking about, where people push down in the market. They step down in terms of properties they're looking for because they can't afford where they are now. And that means, of course, the people on the bottom just have nowhere to go.
So let's look, Norm, now at what the government is actually doing to solve this problem, because it's rather large. It does have this $10 billion housing fund, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot of people that think it's that good an idea or that it will be that effective.
Well, this plan you're referring to is called the Housing Australia Future Fund.
Labor in government will create a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, with the annual investment return to build social and affordable housing and create thousands of jobs.
It's now a proposal in Parliament. They're trying to get it passed. They actually unveiled it in last year's budget. It calls for about 30,000 social and affordable homes to be built over 5 years. So that 30,000 number looks very impressive, but then when you see that it's over 5 years, that's part of the reason it's the government has been having trouble getting it through Parliament, because they need the support of the Greens, and the Greens are basically arguing that it's nowhere near ambitious enough.
They're going to get $10 billion and gamble it on the stock market via the Future Fund and hope that some of the returns can be spent on housing. Except last year, the gamble would have lost $120 million. You certainly wouldn't fund schools.
Groups like Homelessness Australia, they say there's a shortfall of around 400,000 affordable properties in Australia. And ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service, uses the same sort of number. So if you look at what they would want compared to what the Housing Australia Future Fund will provide, it's about, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/4 of what we might actually need. Even if they do get it passed, it's probably not going to be nearly enough to fix this problem.
Right. There doesn't seem like there's an easy solution to this. But what about the budget today? Can the government do any more in this budget to actually solve this problem with housing, this major problem we have in this country?
I would be surprised if we see anything on the scale of what they proposed last year, seeing as they haven't been able to pass that plan yet. So one thing people will be looking for in the budget is rent assistance. That's a program that people who, if they qualify through their incomes, they can apply for rent assistance. There's some speculation rent assistance might be boosted, but the numbers going around are not overly substantial, something like maybe $100 a fortnight, which would be $50 a week, which would be appreciated, but is really not going to make a huge dent for people.
And Norm, we don't really want to be a country where people like Abby and Rhiannon and young people like that are living on the streets. There needs to be a fix.
The real problem with this in the long term, from the advocacy groups I talked to, Sam, is there has to be some real cultural adjustments on what we do policy-wise as a society, really.
Yeah.
One of the things we stopped doing 20 or 30 years ago is we just stopped building a lot of public housing. It's really quite striking. If you visit someone like Abby Manning and her house, she's living there with 6 others in this house, very few of those young people foresee a future where they are owning their own unit or their own house. We're developing a group in our society that doesn't believe they'll ever be able to own homes. And I think that really demands everyone ask a lot of questions from our government leaders about how they are going to fix that situation.
Norman Hammond is the ABC's social affairs correspondent. While there's barely anything to rent long-term, there's a mass of Airbnb and holiday places available. We covered that on April the 18th. Have a listen to Can Australia Revive the Golden Era of Housing? That's in your feed. This episode was produced by Flint Duxfield, Veronica Aphap and Chris Dengate, who also did the mix. Our supervising producer is Stephen Smiley. I'm Sam Hawley. Don't forget, we'll be bringing you a budget special, so look out for that in your feed later this evening. Thanks for listening.